Joining me now is Thom Hartmann, legendary progressive talk show host, also a New York Times bestseller author. In fact, his book, The Last Hours of the Ancient Sunlight, was turned into a movie by Leonardo DiCaprio called 11th Hour. His new book is the one you just saw, The War on Voting, the hidden history of the war on voting. Who stole your vote and how to get it back? Okay, I do want to get it back. So, Thom, always great to see you. So, who stole my vote?
Well, the Republicans. In fact, my proposal to the publishing company was that the title should be The Republican War on Voting. And they were like, well, it's a little too partisan. And I'm like, but the Democrats are not, there's no war on voting from Democrats. It's entirely Republicans.
That's right. And so I remember seeing videos of Paul Weyrich back in, I think, 1980.
During the Reagan campaign.
That's right. So does it go back to there or was it even earlier?
Well, it definitely goes back to there, but back in the 1960s, William Rehnquist, who was a big bear of a guy, he was like 6'2" and 280 or something like that, a big guy. He used to stand, this is how he made his chops in the Republican Party when he lived in Arizona. He would stand in the voting lines where Hispanics and Native Americans were voting and loud voices with his clipboard, and he was a lawyer, of course, so he ended up Chief Justice, yelling, "You don't look like you should be voting here. Prove to me you're who," and basically intimidating voters. So, this goes back a long ways, but there is a new twist on it that the Republicans introduced in 2002 and really played out well in 2004 that, frankly, I think just in the last couple of years, in large part because of Stacey Abrams in Georgia, Americans are starting to figure out what the game is.
So before we get to 2002 and 2004, part of the reason I wanted to go back in history and find out when the Republicans started trying to intimidate people's vote is one, because you're so good at history and that I wanted to find out. But two, because I wanted to see when the turn came. And it's interesting that the turn seems to have come around the time that the Republican Party went from being the more progressive party to the more conservative party, and the Southern strategy and trying to get the white racist votes in the South, et cetera, instead of being the party that is more expansive and trying to get everybody involved. Do you think that might have had something to do with it?
I think it's possible. I think really the modern era of the Republican Party stealing votes came about as a result of the Nixon disaster. After that, there was, and particularly after Jerry Ford got defeated, for president by an unknown peanut farmer from Georgia, there were books being written about how this, the Republican Party is going the way of the Whigs. But coincidental with that, in 1976, as you know, the Supreme Court, the Buckley decision, said for the very first time in American history that if billionaires want to own politicians or want to run for political office themselves and use their own money without limit, that's no longer considered bribery or corruption. That's considered First Amendment protected free speech. 2 years later, in the Boston versus Bellotti decision, they extended that logic to corporations. And that opened a floodgate of corporate and billionaire money into the Republican Party. At that point, the Democratic Party was still funded by the unions, and so they weren't interested. And the consequence of that, we're still living with. That was when the Republican Party in the modern era really sold out, was 1980.
Let's talk about now the newer era of voter intimidation and how they're trying to steal your vote since then. So what happened in 2002 and 2004 that you mentioned?
Well, it really starts in 2000. In 2000, George W. Bush needed Florida to win. George Bush was the governor of Texas. His brother Jeb was the governor of Florida. And so Texas gave Florida a list of Texas felons. Florida compared that list with the list of Florida voters. And because African Americans and Hispanics have relatively small name pools, most African American names come from English, most Hispanic names come from Spanish, whereas the broader population has names from Greek and Scandinavian languages and all kinds of things. There were a lot of people who had the same first and last names, and they didn't match middle names. So depending on whose lawsuit you're looking at, Jeb Bush threw somewhere between 30 and 90,000 African Americans off the voting rolls in Florida in the months just before the 2000 election. This put George Bush in a position to steal the election with the help of the Supreme Court. But when the word leaked out a few months later that this is how he did it, people were furious. The ACLU launched, I mean, there were multiple lawsuits against him. There were demonstrations in the streets. It was huge. So the Republican Party said, okay, we got to figure out, this works really well, right? Comparing these voter lists and throwing off people with common names, which is mostly Hispanics and African Americans, a lot of Asians too. But they're a smaller part of the population. This works really well, but we got to figure out a way to do it that doesn't piss people off. They don't really know about it. And so in 2002, with the Help America Vote Act, and Bob Ney, who was a Republican from Ohio, was the principal author of that at the time, and he's a friend of mine. And he said, we came up with this thing called the provisional ballot. And the provisional ballot is, if you're not on the voter list and you show up to vote, they don't give you a regular ballot, they give you a provisional ballot. It looks identical. You think that you voted, but it goes in a different box or in a different kind of envelope, depending on the state. And they're simply never counted. Unless the election is contested. And even if the election is contested, the only provisional ballots that are actually counted are those where people went within the following week after the election to the Secretary of State's office and proved with birth certificates and passports and proof that they used to be registered and proof of residence that they are who they say they are and get themselves back on the voter rolls, which is maybe 2 people out of every 1,000. So starting in 2004, and we saw this hugely. I mean, John Edwards on my show, the vice presidential candidate in 2004, was raging about this because John Kerry wouldn't take these guys on. There were more unopened provisional ballots in Ohio than the margin of George Bush's victory in Ohio, and of course, Ohio gave him the election. So what happens is, and 2000, the exit poll showed that Bush had lost Florida by tens of thousands of votes. Nobody could figure that out until after we figured out what happened. In 2004, the exit polls showed that John Kerry easily won Ohio. But of course, that's not what happened in the official vote. And the reason why is because people got provisional ballots. They didn't know that they'd never be counted. They walked out of the voting booth and they saw the exit pollster and told them that they had voted for John Kerry. It got duly noted. And thus was born Redshift, which is where the exit polls say the Democrat won, the official results say the Republican won, a phenomena that largely only exists in states with Republican secretaries of state. And in some cases is as high as 5.7, 5.9, 6% of a shift. And, we took down the Ukrainian election, the Yanukovych election in 2004, because there was about a 5-point shift between the exit polls and the actual ballots. Every country in Europe calls elections the night of the election based on exit polls, but it takes 3 days to count the vote. We just saw this with Boris Johnson. It took 3 days to count the vote, but they called it that night, or they largely called it that night. It was close. If they're within 1%, they always put a caveat on the exit polls. So now we see, in fact, let me just give you some real quick stats here. This is from page 92 of my book. In the 2016 election, Hillary, and I'm going to round these to even numbers, Hillary Clinton, according to the exit polls, carried Florida 48 to 46%. But according to the actual count, Trump carried it 49 to 47%, or 48%, 47.8. In North Carolina, the exit polls showed Clinton winning 48 to 46%. But the actual result was Trump 49, Clinton 46. That's a 5.9% redshift in North Carolina. In Pennsylvania, the Clinton, according to the exit polls, won by 50.5% to Trump's 46%. But when the eligible votes were counted, Trump carried the state by 48 to 47%, a redshift of 5.6%. In Wisconsin, there was a redshift of 5.1%. Again, the exit polls showed Hillary Clinton beat Trump by almost 4 points, 48.2 to 44.3. But the official vote after Scott Walker's voting purges were done was quite different. The exit polls show clearly, for example, that Hillary Clinton won the Electoral College as well as the majority of votes in the United States. So this game is going on.
If I was a Democrat that was going into an election like that in a red district or a red state, I'd do everything in my power to make sure that they didn't do that. Lawsuits, press, you name it. So, and now I know folks like Stacey Abrams, Andrew Gillum are mounting an effort. How good an effort are the Democrats, the Democratic Party overall, putting forward to combat all this? Because just accepting giant electoral swings. Of course, all these close states are going to be decided within 6 points. You're just letting the Republicans steal every election if you do that. So what's their counterattack in this? Does it have any chance of working?
Well, up until really the last 4 years or so, the Democratic Party had their head in the sand. Back in 2005, after that disaster in Ohio, a group of us who were on Air America went to the U.S. Senate, went to D.C., and we met with 6 or 7 Democratic senators and raised this issue. At the time, we thought it was probably rigged voting machines. We didn't know about provisional ballots and purges. But in any case, we were encouraging these Democratic senators to do something about it. And one of the senators got up and said, well, a senator whose name you would immediately recognize, she said, well, here's the problem. If we go off on these kind of conspiracy theory things, then American voters, particularly Democrats, will not trust that their vote will be counted. And if they don't trust their vote will be counted, they're not going to show up and vote. So we don't want to be scaring people away from the polls. And that's been kind of the official position. I've had that conversation actually with a number of Democrats over the years. That's been pretty much the official position of the Democratic Party up until it became so obvious in Georgia that Brian Kemp, who'd thrown 1 million voters off the voting rolls in the 4 years before the election, 200,000 just in the year before the election, and then he got 50,000. He beat Stacey Abrams by 50,000 votes. It became so obvious that it can't be ignored anymore, and thus H.R. 1, the first piece of legislation out of Nancy Pelosi's House, actually solves much of this problem, which is why Mitch McConnell won't even have a conversation about it.
All right. Well, I'm glad that 20 some odd years later, they're onto it.
There you go.
Which pretty much describes the Democratic Party. We'll be in the saddle 20 years later. We'll show them. But it is good news, and I'm thrilled that Stacey Abrams and Gillum and others are working on it and applaud their work. All right, everybody check out The Hidden History of the War on Voting. Thom, as always, a pleasure. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Cenk. It's always an honor to be on your show.
Thanks for watching this free clip of the Young Turks. Don't forget to become a TYT member today. For more exclusive content, join now at tyt.com/join.